I'm Audrey Calloway, 54, and I went from holding the broom in my father's machine shop to wearing 3 stars as a lieutenant general in the United States Marine Corps. For 30 years, I wired money home, slept in hospital chairs, and let my family introduce me as the one who does paperwork for the Pentagon. But when a Marine at a defense expo waved me toward the loading dock and my own brother watched it happen and walked inside without a word, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been written off by the very people you gave everything to? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe. The summer I turned 10, my father built a lathe stand out of scrap angle iron, and he let my brother Mitchell run the machine while I held the broom. That was the arrangement in our house, though nobody ever said it out loud. Mitchell was 18, headed for an engineering degree, and my father looked at him the way other men looked at the ocean. I was the younger one, the girl, the kid who asked too many questions and got handed a dustpan for her trouble. My father's name was Raymond Calloway, and he was a machinist in Scranton, Pennsylvania for 41 years. He measured worth in things you could hold, an engine block, a paycheck, a son. He was not cruel about it. He simply had a fixed amount of light in him, and he aimed all of it at Mitchell, and the rest of us learned to read by what bounced off the walls. I want to be fair to my brother, because fairness is the whole point of this story. Mitchell was good to me when we were young. He was the one who taught me to solder, sitting on the back steps with a radio he had pulled out of a junkyard Plymouth. He was patient in a way our father never was. And in the summer of 1985, when I was 14 and he was 18, we climbed the slag heaps behind the old colliery with a model rocket we had built together over 3 weekends, and we launched it so high we lost it in the sun. While we were waiting for the parachute to show, Mitchell said something I carried for 40 years. He said, "You know you're the smartest person in this family, right?" He said it plainly, the way you say a fact. Then the rocket came down in the weeds and we went home for dinner, and my father asked Mitchell, and only Mitchell, how the launch went. That was the bond and that was the crack in it, both on the same afternoon. My mother, Joan, saw all of it. She was a quiet woman who worked the front office at a dental practice for 30 years, and she had a way of standing beside you at a sink so that her shoulder said what she was not allowed to say at the table. When I told my parents in the fall of 1989 that I had won a Navy ROTC scholarship with a Marine option, my father looked at the letter for a long moment. Mitchell's job offer from a defense contractor was sitting on the same table, opened that morning, and my father had already read it twice. He said, "Marines. Well, somebody has to answer the phones." He did not mean it as a wound. That is the strange part. He meant it as a fact about the world, the same way Mitchell had meant his sentence on the slag heap. The two facts could not both be true, and I spent most of my life deciding which one to believe. My mother drove me to the bus station that January. She pressed $50 into my hand, folded small, the way women of her generation handed money. She said, "Call me when you get there." She did not say, "Be safe," and she did not say, "Prove them wrong." I have always loved her for that. I commissioned as a second lieutenant in the spring of 1993, on a parade field at Penn State with my whole graduating class sweating through our uniforms. My mother sat in the 3rd row with a disposable camera. My father did not come. Mitchell did not come either. His company had a product launch that week, a guidance component for a missile program, and the family calendar bent around it the way it always bent. I stood there afterward in my dress blues, scanning a crowd for 2 faces I already knew were not in it. And I told myself it did not matter. It mattered. I just put it somewhere I would not trip over it for a while. The Marine Corps gave me communications, which my father heard as telephones and my brother eventually translated, at family tables, as paperwork. What it actually meant was networks, the nervous system of every unit that moves or shoots or calls for help. I took to it the way Mitchell had taken to the lathe. There was a rightness in it, a feeling of being finally allowed to touch the machine. Through the 90s, I did the work and came home when I could. I flew back for every Christmas I was not deployed. When the machine shop hit a bad year in 1998 and the bank started calling, I wired money home and never mentioned it again, and my father never mentioned it either, though my mother told me he knew exactly where it came from. In 2003, when my mother had her hip replaced, I took leave and slept in a chair in her hospital room for 4 nights. Mitchell sent flowers. They were nice flowers. That sentence became a kind of private shorthand for me over the years. Mitchell sent flowers. I made captain in 1997 and took a company at Camp Lejeune 2 years later. I made major in 2004 and deployed to Iraq that same year, running communications for a regimental combat team, and again in 2007, when the networks I managed carried the voices of 19-year-olds calling for medevac through dust storms. I will only say that when you have heard what a radio can carry, you never again think of communications as answering phones. None of this made it back to Scranton in any form my family could use. They had decided what I was in 1989, and the decision was load-bearing. My father would introduce Mitchell at the VFW hall as my son, the engineer, builds the things that keep us strong. Then he would gesture at me, half a beat late, and say, "And Audrey's in the service. Doing fine." The gesture always reminded me of a man waving at a car he was not sure he recognized. Families write a ledger early, and they do not like to revise it. Every dollar I wired, every leave I burned, every chair I slept in went into a column nobody ever totaled. Rank does not transfer. I know that now. What I knew then was simpler. I had a brother who had once told me I was the smartest person in the family, a father who aimed his light where he aimed it, and a mother with a disposable camera who showed up. For a long time, that was enough to keep showing up myself. It stayed enough through 2 wars, 11 moves, and 20 years of holidays. It stopped being enough at a convention center loading dock in October of 2025. But I am getting ahead of myself. The distance between my brother and me did not arrive all at once. It accumulated, the way rust accumulates in seasons, in coats so thin you only notice when the metal finally lets go. Mitchell rose fast at his company through the 90s and 2000s. He was good, unusually good, at turning engineering into money, and by 2012 he was a vice president with a corner office in a glass building outside Philadelphia, and a way of entering his own childhood home like a visiting dignitary. Thanksgiving that year is the one I remember, because it was the year the joke got its final shape. We were 16 people around 2 pushed-together tables, and a cousin's new husband asked me what I did. Before I could answer, Mitchell answered for me. "She does paperwork for the Pentagon," he said. "Somebody's got to staple the budget." The table laughed, the easy laugh of people relieved to have the hierarchy confirmed, and the conversation moved on to Mitchell's program, which had just been written up in a trade magazine he happened to have in the car. At the time of the joke, I was a lieutenant colonel running fielded combat network programs across the entire Marine Corps. I had $800 million of taxpayer equipment under my signature and a Pentagon parking pass my brother would have framed. I said none of that. I passed the green beans. My mother caught my eye down the length of the table, and her look was its own complete sentence, and I shook my head a 1/4 inch and we let it go. That was our treaty, hers and mine. We let it go together for decades. My father got sick in 2017. Emphysema, the slow kind, the kind that takes a man apart 1 flight of stairs at a time. I was a colonel at Quantico by then, running a program office at Marine Corps Systems Command, and for the next 2 years, I drove the corridor between Quantico and Scranton almost every weekend. 4 hours up on Friday night, 4 hours back on Sunday. I managed his pulmonologist appointments from my car. I hired the home aide, and when the agency raised the rate, I paid the difference and told my mother it was a veteran's benefit. It was not a veteran's benefit. Mitchell visited twice in 2 years. Once for an afternoon in 2018 when he parked his car so it would not be blocked in, and once at the end. He was busy, and his busy was real. I want to be fair about that. There was always a review, a milestone, a flight he could not move. But I was busy too. The difference was never the calendar. The difference was which lines in it we treated as immovable, and for Mitchell, the immovable lines were never drawn through Scranton. My father died in March of 2019 in his own bed, with my mother holding one hand and me holding the other. Mitchell arrived 4 hours later and stood in the kitchen with his coat on. At the funeral, my brother gave the eulogy. He talked about our father's hands, about the dignity of making things, about carrying on Dad's legacy of building American strength, and it was a good eulogy. I will not pretend otherwise. Near the end, he thanked everyone who helped with Dad's care these last years. Everyone. I sat in the front pew in my civilian black, 2 years of weekends folded into that one word. And I watched him look directly over my head as he said it. My mother's hand found mine on the pew between us and pressed down hard, once, like a stamp. After that, something in me went administrative about the family. I still came home. I still sent money when the roof needed work. But I stopped offering them my life because they had nowhere to put it. They proved that the next year, when I was promoted to Brigadier General, it was 2020, so the ceremony was small. A handful of people at the Pentagon, my mother on a video call. I phoned home afterward. My mother cried and said my father would have been proud, which we both agreed to pretend was true. Then Mitchell took the phone and asked, "So a Brigadier General, that's like a manager, basically?" He was not mocking me. That is the part I need you to understand. He had simply never built a shelf in his mind for the information, and at 49 years old, with 1 star on each shoulder, I stopped handing him things to drop. Major General came in 2022. I mentioned it at Christmas, once, factually, the way you mention a new car. My ledger entry did not move. Then, in 2024, the Commandant asked me to serve as Deputy Commandant for Combat Development and Integration. And the story stops being about dinners, so I will say plainly what the job is. The directorate I led decides what the Marine Corps of the next 20 years needs to fight with. We write the requirements, run the war games, and shape the programs before industry ever sees a dollar. 3 stars, a seat at the table where the future gets argued into existence. And one of the programs my directorate had shaped for a decade, the next generation combat system that was about to be unveiled to the public, was built by my brother's company. His own division, in fact. My signature sat upstream of his entire professional life. And he had no idea, because he had never once asked. My friend, Denise Whitaker, a retired colonel who has known me since we were lieutenants with one good blazer between us, used to needle me about it over wine. "One day he's going to walk into a room you own, Audrey," she said. "Promise me you'll let him feel it." I laughed and changed the subject. I was not laughing because it was funny. I was laughing because some part of me had already picked the room. I had not picked it, of course. Life picked it. Life has better staging instincts than any of us. It picked a convention center in National Harbor in October of 2025, and it put a 26-year-old sergeant at the door with a clipboard, and it put my brother in the VIP lane at the exact moment I would need one person in my family to say 4 easy words. That's my sister, Sergeant. The morning of the Expo, I dressed in a plain charcoal suit and flat shoes and pulled my hair back the way I have worn it since Iraq. The keynote was mine at 1300. The unveiling of the system, 10 years of my directorate's work under a black drape on a stage, would follow my remarks. My uniform traveled on a hanger in a garment bag because I had a habit, old and deliberate, of walking exhibition floors unannounced before I spoke at them. You learn more in 20 unbadged minutes than in 20 briefed hours. So I arrived as a woman in a gray suit, pulling a rolling case of briefing materials, indistinguishable from 10,000 other people. I want to describe the entrance precisely because every word of it matters to everything that came after. The main doors of the hall faced the river, a wall of glass with banners 4 stories tall, and under the banners ran the morning lines. General attendance to the left. Exhibitors and VIP credentials to the right. A shorter lane with a blue carpet, because even in this industry, especially in this industry, status gets its own flooring. Access control was a mix of contract security and Marines in service uniform. There's ceremonial presence and screening support for the Distinguished Visitors Program. At the head of my line stood a sergeant, 26 or so, squared away, clipboard in one hand. His name tape read, Lambert. I had my credentials in my hand. Government identification, the keynote speaker packet, all of it, and I was reaching to present them when Sergeant Lambert looked at my rolling case. Not my face, my case. And jerked his thumb over his shoulder toward the service road, casual as a man flicking water off his fingers. "Vendors around back," he said. Not a question. Not a, "May I see your credentials, ma'am?" 3 words, and a thumb, and his eyes were already past me to the next person in line, because I had been assessed, categorized, and routed, all in under 2 seconds, on the strength of luggage and a gray suit. A woman with a case. Vendor. Around back. And here is the moment I need you to see. Over his shoulder, 15 feet away on the blue carpet of the VIP lane, stood my brother. Lanyard out, badge bright, on his way into a hall built around a machine my directorate had conceived. Mitchell saw the whole exchange. He saw the thumb. He saw me. Our eyes met for a full second, which is a very long time between two people who learn to solder on the same back steps. My brother smiled and adjusted his lanyard and said, "Rules are rules, sis. Around back's not so bad." Then he turned and walked through the glass doors into the warm light of the atrium and was gone. Sergeant Lambert never heard the sentence. He was already checking the next badge. He could not have known that in one motion of his thumb, he had handed a 54-year-old woman the cleanest possible X-ray of her own family. The sergeant made an assumption. Assumptions are what training exists to fix. What Mitchell made was a choice. I did not pull rank. I want that on the record, not as modesty, but as fact, because what I did instead became the spine of everything after. I closed my credentials, took the handle of my case, and walked. Around the building, past the bollards, down the service road, between the catering trucks, through the loading dock with its pallet jacks and crate stencils, and the good, honest smell of diesel and cardboard. I held the door for two caterers carrying sheet pans. One of them said, "Thanks, hun." It was, by some distance, the warmest thing anyone had said to me all morning. I had walked into war rooms on 3 continents. I had briefed in bunkers, on flight lines, once in a tent in Anbar with the generator dying every 11 minutes. The longest walk of my life was around the back of a convention center in Maryland, pulling a rolling case, carrying my brother's silence. Inside, in a service corridor under the exhibit hall, my aide found me. Captain Marisol Vega, 29, sharp as a new blade, and at that moment, very close to detonating. She had been tracking my phone, expecting me at the speaker entrance, and when I told her, factually, how I had come in, the look on her face would have been worth the walk all by itself. She wanted the Expo's security director. She wanted names. I stopped her with 2 fingers. "No," I said. "Let the day teach it." She did not understand, and I did not explain. I just knew that I had spent 30 years correcting nothing, and the universe had finally volunteered to handle my correspondence. At 12:40, I changed in the speaker suite. There is a particular quiet that comes with putting on the uniform every time, even now. The weight settles across your shoulders, and the person your family never managed to see is suddenly right there in the mirror. 3 silver stars to a shoulder, 4 decades folded into ribbons over the left. I looked at her for a moment, then I went and stood in the wings. The keynote hall held 2,000 seats and it was full. Front row, center, sat the Joint Chiefs. The chairman, General Everett Stone, United States Army, a man I had sat beside through 2 years of program reviews. Beside him, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Lloyd Pratt, who had pinned my 3rd star. The chiefs of the other services down the row, a line of 4 stars assembled because the system under the black drape was, for once, worth all of their calendars at the same time. And at the doors of the hall, rotated in from the morning entrance to support the distinguished visitors detail, stood Sergeant Cody Lambert, clipboard at his side. The announcer read my name. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Deputy Commandant for Combat Development and Integration, Lieutenant General Audrey Calloway, United States Marine Corps." I stepped out of the wings, and General Stone rose to his feet. Not the polite half-rise of a man being courteous. He stood the way soldiers stand, fully, and he was smiling. And down the row, the chiefs rose with him, one after another. A front row of 4 stars on its feet, and behind them 2,000 seats followed, the sound of it like weather moving through a building. Stone stepped forward to the edge of the stage as I crossed it and took my hand and said, loud enough for the microphones to catch it, "General Calloway, we've been waiting for you." I have replayed the next 3 seconds more times than I will admit. At the doors, a clipboard arm went slack. Sergeant Lambert's face did the arithmetic, the gray suit, the rolling case, the thumb, and arrived at its sum in full view of his detail. He did not look away. I will give him that for the rest of my life. He stood there and took the weight of it standing up. And in the contractor block, beneath his own company's 4-story banner, beside his chief executive, stood my brother. Mitchell was not applauding. He was very still, the particular stillness of a man watching a wall in his life come down in slow motion. The 3-star his entire program answered to, the requirements signature upstream of his division, his budget, his bonus, was the woman he had watched get thumbed toward the loading dock that morning. The smartest person in the family, by his own measurement, taken at 14, and shelved for 40 years. I gave the keynote. It went well. They had, after all, been waiting for me. Afterward came the receiving line, and the part I am least proud of enjoying. Mitchell's chief executive came through with his leadership team and shook my hand with both of his. "General, your team's requirements made this program," he said. "Your fingerprints are on every frame of that machine." And then, gesturing behind him, "You know, Mitchell Calloway, I believe, one of our senior vice presidents." My brother put out his hand. "Audrey," he began. I shook his hand for exactly as long as protocol requires, not 1 second more. "Good to see the company represented," I said, and moved down the line. It was not cruelty. I have checked that math 100 times since, and I stand by it. It was the withdrawal of a subsidy. For 30 years, I had met my family 9/10 of the way and called the remaining 10th their warmth. That afternoon, I simply stood still and let the actual distance show. At the edge of the room, Sergeant Lambert waited at parade rest, visibly braced to be ended. I let my eyes rest on him a moment longer than comfort allows, long enough for him to know that I knew and that the matter was not finished, and then I walked on. The conversation we needed was not for a ballroom. Mitchell stayed under the banner as the room emptied around him. VIP badge hanging from his neck like a receipt for something that no longer existed. My mother likes to say that God wastes nothing. I do not know about God, but I can testify about that afternoon. It wasted nothing. By the time the floor lights dimmed that evening, the story had already escaped. Somebody's phone had caught the moment the chairman rose, and somebody else, one of the caterers I have always suspected, and I hope she dines out on it forever, had mentioned the woman in the gray suit who came through the loading dock at 9 that morning. By the next afternoon, the two halves had found each other, and the Expo had its legend, the 3-star who got sent around back. I never confirmed it, never commented. Legends do their best work, unsupervised. That night I sat in a hotel bar in Arlington with Denise Whitaker and a glass of Cabernet I mostly turned in circles. Denise had retired 2 years earlier and acquired the terrifying clarity of a woman with nothing left to manage but the truth. I told her the whole day, the thumb, the lanyard, the chairman, the receiving line. She listened the way she has listened since we were lieutenants, with her chin on her fist and her eyes doing the filing. When I finished, she said, "The sergeant didn't know who you were. Mitchell did. Only one of those is forgivable by training." I argued, a little out of 40 years of habit. "He was caught off guard," I said. "He panicked. It is easier to walk through a door than to make a scene at one." Denise let me run out of string and then asked the only question that mattered. If it had been his chief executive in that line, she said, would he have found the words? We both knew the answer. He would have vaulted the rope. So the sting was never the sergeant. I knew that before my second glass. A 26-year-old with a clipboard and a throughput problem made a snap judgment about luggage, and he was wrong, and being wrong in that particular way is a curable condition. What my brother had was not a condition. It was a verdict, rendered decades ago, that I was the discount member of the family, and the verdict had simply spoken first, before his loyalty could clear its throat. Around back's not so bad. The sentence had cost him nothing. It had been sitting in him, preformed, for years. The next morning, while I was reviewing slides in the speaker suite, Captain Vega appeared in the doorway with a particular expression I had not seen on her before. "Ma'am," she said, "there is a Sergeant Lambert requesting 5 minutes. Through his gunnery, Sergeant. He's outside." A sergeant asking to stand in front of a lieutenant general he wronged is a private asking to visit the sun. Every layer of his chain of command had to say yes, and every layer of it now knew why. He came in at attention, eyes locked on the wall above my head, uniform like a knife edge. I told him to stand at ease, and he did not noticeably stand at ease. And then he said the thing he had clearly drafted and redrafted all night, and it was better than most after-action reviews I have read from full colonels. "I profiled your luggage instead of checking your credentials, General," he said. "There's no version where that's the job. It won't happen again to anyone of any rank or no rank. Not of any rank. He had already worked out that the failure would have been the same if I really had been a vendor. The discourtesy was the crime. My stars were just the spotlight. For half a second, looking at him, I saw Mitchell at 18 on the slag heap, soldering iron in his hand, patient with a little sister's questions. The resemblance was not physical. It was the rarer thing, the willingness to be corrected. I asked Lambert what he thought should happen now. He blinked. He had prepared for sentencing, not consultation. Then he straightened a degree further, which I had not thought geometrically possible, and said, "The screening protocol, let me improvise. General. Credentials first, every person, every lane, no judgment calls on appearance." It should be written that way. I told him to write it then. He looked at me. I told him I was not in the habit of repeating requirements, and something behind his eyes came back online, and he said, "Yes, ma'am." And that was the whole meeting. I declined to make a formal report of the incident. I told the Expo's security director, who had materialized that morning in a state of professional anguish, that his process had failed before his Marine did, and that I considered the matter closed, pending one written protocol revision. Accountability without humiliation. It is what I had wanted my whole life from the people at my own kitchen table. I could at least hand it to a stranger at a loading dock. Mitchell called that night. I watched the phone ring and let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message twice. Once for the words and once for the architecture. "Audrey, hey, it's me. Listen, I'm sorry about the mix-up at the doors. The whole thing was ridiculous. Anyway, I hope this isn't going to be a thing. We've got the program review cycle coming up, and the last thing anybody needs is awkwardness. Call me." There was an apology in it, technically, the way there is tomato and ketchup. Sorry about the mix-up. The doors had malfunctioned, apparently. And then, within 9 seconds, the actual cargo of the call. The program review. The optics. The fear, not that he had failed his sister at a door, but that his sister's stars now hung over his career. 30 years of my smallness had been the load-bearing wall of his comfort, and he could feel the building shift. I did not call back, not out of strategy. I simply found I had nothing in inventory to say. Instead, I went home that weekend and took down the photograph I keep on the bookshelf in my study. 2 kids on a slag heap in 1985, squinting, sunburned, a cardboard and balsa rocket between them. I sat with it for a long time, and somewhere in that hour, the pattern finally surfaced. Whole, like something rising in a lake. I had spent my entire adult life believing I was being discreet, professional, disciplined, the quiet officer who did not need her family to understand her work. And all of it was true, and underneath all of it, something else had been running the whole time. I had kept myself small at their tables because their version of me was the price of admission, and I had paid it, year after year, decade after decade, because some part of me believed that if I ever stood at my full height in that house, the ceiling would simply reveal that it had never been built for me. I had not been hiding my stars from my family. I had been hiding their indifference from myself. That is the sentence I came to at my kitchen table at 11 at night, 54 years old, with a model rocket photograph in my hands. The voicemail notification was still sitting on my phone, unanswered, when the screen finally went dark. I let it. What I did next, I did carefully, because anger makes excellent fuel and a terrible navigator. I gave it 2 weeks. Then on a Sunday in early November, I called my mother, not to recruit her, but because she had spent 50 years watching this play from the wings and had earned a copy of the script. I told her, in plain words, what my job was. I told her that the Marine Corps had one officer whose signature decided what the next 20 years of Marines would carry into harm's way, and that for the past year that officer had been her daughter. I told her about the hall and the front row, and that when I walked out, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff stood up, and then all of them did. My mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father would have stood up too, honey. He just never knew how." I have turned that sentence over many times. I think it is the kindest thing anyone has ever said about Raymond Calloway, and I think it is also a flag of surrender flown on his behalf, and I have decided it can be both. My mother spent her marriage translating a man who came from people who did not say things. The translation was an act of love. It was also, for 50 years, a subsidy, and watching her finally set it down taught me how to set down mine. Then I wrote to my brother, 3 sentences. I have them memorized, not because I labored over them, but because 3 sentences is what the truth came to. What happened at the door was the sergeant's mistake, and he has owned it like a professional. What happened beside the door was yours. Call me when you can say that second part out loud. I read it once and sent it. No salutation flourishes, no softening clause, none of the upholstery I had spent a lifetime nailing onto every hard thing I said to my family. Send, done. He did not reply for 6 weeks. The silence is loud. You check. You tell yourself you are not checking, and you check. Some mornings I drafted the gracious reply I would send to his apology, and some mornings the colder one, and the discipline was in sending neither. In the meantime, I had one more piece of business, the least cinematic scene in the story, and the one I am proudest of. I went to see the Ethics Council at headquarters, voluntarily, with Captain Vega taking notes, and I put the whole situation on the record. My brother's name, his division, his company's position on the program my directorate had shaped. I requested formal recusal from the source selection annex that touched his division's contract line, and I got it in writing. The council, a patient civilian attorney who had clearly expected a thornier meeting, asked if there had been any actual conflict. I said no. There had been a loading dock and a lanyard and 40 years of family arithmetic and absolutely no conflict of interest, and I intended to keep it provable. The story of this program, I told him, will be that nothing about it ever bent around my family. Either direction. Here's why that mattered. Revenge was available. It is always available to people with rank, and it almost never looks like revenge. A schedule that slips, a requirement that tightens. I could have made my brother's professional life quietly, deniably miserable. The recusal was me taking my own weapons and locking them in front of a witness. Whatever happened to Mitchell from here would be the work of his own choices. I was not going to lift a finger. I was just going to stop holding the umbrella. Thanksgiving 2025 came before any reply did. I drove to Scranton because my mother was not going to pay for her son's silence, and because boundaries that punish bystanders are just tantrums with better posture. I was, by every account, including my own, pleasant that day. I carved nothing and claimed no territory. I helped my mother with the gravy and let her tell me I stir too fast, which she has been telling me since President Carter. With Mitchell, I was courteous and completely unavailable, a closed door with good manners. He orbited all afternoon, glass in hand, waiting for the opening I had always provided, the soft moment when I would absorb the awkwardness and reupholster the silence. I just did not do my job. I let every silence sit there at its full, awful length. You learn something watching a confident man wait for a door that does not open. Twice I saw him assemble the approach, the breath, the half-step, the rehearsed first word, and twice it died before it reached the air. At the dessert table, he stood beside me for a full minute, close enough that the old shorthand should have kicked in, and I ate my pie and asked my mother about her hip, and eventually he drifted back to the den. Driving home that night, I felt no triumph. I want to be exact about that. What I felt was lighter in a way that had nothing to do with him, the way your shoulders feel when you finally set down a bag you forgot you were carrying. The consequences I had declined to manufacture arrived anyway, that winter, on their own schedule. It turns out I had never needed to lift a finger. I had only ever needed to stop standing between my brother and the weather. The first report came in December from Denise, who retired from the Marine Corps, but will never retire from intelligence work. At an industry holiday reception in Crystal City, in earshot of half his leadership team, a rival executive had grinned at my brother and said, "Hey, Calloway, heard you let your own sister get badged to the loading dock. Is that a family discount?" The laughter, Denise reported, was general, and it was not with him. Mitchell had spent 30 years accumulating exactly one asset, the impression of being a man, on the inside of every room. The Expo story inverted it in 9 words. Industry people can forgive malice. What they cannot forgive is a man who does not know what he is looking at. In January, his chief executive moved him sideways. Not fired, nothing so dramatic. He was repositioned, the program's customer-facing portfolio, the part of his job that put him in rooms with stars and decision memos, went to a younger executive described in the announcement as bringing fresh alignment to the customer relationship. Mitchell kept his title and lost his oxygen. I learned the details, third hand, through Denise. The phrase that made it back to me, allegedly from the chief executive himself, was, The misunderstanding was visible from the front row. I took no satisfaction in it. I had braced to. The real version came with nothing. I read Denise's message twice, set the phone down, and felt only the flat, gray recognition that the win I had actually wanted had never been his loss. It had been 4 words at a door, and they were not purchasable with his suffering. I will tell you what did bring me satisfaction that winter, because the contrast is the lesson. In late January, a note reached my office through channels from a gunnery sergeant, Aldo Birch, Sergeant Lambert's supervisor. Lambert had written the after-action himself, unprompted. He had drafted a credential first screening protocol, every person, every lane, identification verified before any routing decision, no discretionary judgments on appearance. And he had pushed it up his chain with a cover memo that reportedly began, "I wrote this because I failed the standard, and I would rather be the reason it exists than the reason it was needed." His unit adopted it for all distinguished visitor and event support details. Birch's note to my office was 2 paragraphs of a senior NCO being proud and trying to sound procedural about it. Vega asked if I wanted to send a formal reply. I told her to send exactly 2 words. Noted. Good. In the dialect Lambert and I both speak, that is a paragraph. One Saturday in February, I was at my kitchen table with coffee when the doorbell rang, and the mail carrier handed me an envelope addressed in handwriting I had not seen since birthday cards in the 1980s. 4 pages, both sides. My brother writes the way he was taught to draft engineering change proposals, numbered thoughts, no adjectives he could not defend. It is, it turns out, a devastating format for an apology. He did not open with the loading dock. He opened with the eulogy. He wrote that he had stood at our father's funeral and thanked everyone, and that he had seen me in the front pew when he said it, and that the word everyone had been a coward's word, chosen in the moment because my actual name would have required him to admit what the care had cost me and what it had cost him to be absent from it. He went backward from there, year by year, like a man walking a pipeline looking for the leak. The Thanksgiving joke, which he remembered word for word, it turned out, the way you remember things you are guilty of, not things you forgot. The promotion call where he asked if a general was like a manager. The commissioning he missed for a product launch, he could no longer remember anything about except that it had seemed immovable. And then, on the 3rd page, the sentence I had not known I was waiting for. "You were always the smartest person in the family." I knew it at 18, and I said it once and never again. Because Dad couldn't hold 2 of us, and I let you be the one he put down. It was easier to inherit his eyes than to argue with them. At the Expo, you walked around the building I was standing in front of, and I have been trying ever since to remember one time I ever stood in front of a building for you. The letter did not ask for anything. That was its other mercy. No request for a call, no proposed lunch, no can we put this behind us. It ended. I am not asking you to answer this. I am telling you that you were right, the second part out loud, like you said. The door was his mistake. Beside the door was mine. It has been mine for 30 years. I read it twice at the kitchen table, and then I did something I cannot fully explain. I got up, took the model rocket photograph down from the study shelf, and put the letter in the drawer beneath it. The drawer where I keep the things that are finished being argued with. Not answered. Kept. There is a difference, and I needed a few days to live in it. Because here's the thing about a real apology. It does not flood you with warmth. The first thing it does is grief work. It hands you confirmation that it was all actually true. Every entry you had, half convinced yourself you were imagining. He really had seen me in the front pew. He really had known, at 18. Vindication and loss arrive in the same envelope. I gave it 9 days. Then I called him and I said, "There's a diner on Moosic Street that still does the rice pudding. Saturday, 10 o'clock. Come alone and don't bring a presentation." He laughed, 1 syllable, the first unguarded sound I had heard from him in years. He said, "Yes, ma'am," and then quickly, "Sorry, I didn't mean," and I said, "I know what you meant. Saturday. The diner on Moosic Street has been the same diner since we were children. Vinyl booths the color of root beer, a pie case that rotates with the gravity of a planetarium. I got there first, took a booth in the back, and watched my brother come through the door 2 minutes early, which for Mitchell is a form of prayer. He wore no lanyard of any kind. He sat down across from me and put his hands flat on the table, like a man surrendering tools at a checkpoint, and he started, predictably, with the doc. "Audrey, what happened at the Expo?" I stopped him there. The dock was a Tuesday, I said. I need you to go back 30 years. To his lasting credit, he did. For an hour, my brother walked the whole pipeline out loud. The Thanksgiving joke and the laugh he had farmed from it. The funeral and the word everyone, which he said he had heard himself say, as if from across the room, knowing it was wrong in real time and writing it anyway. The flowers in 2003. He even produced, unprompted, the detail I had thought was mine alone, that he sent flowers when Mom had her hip done, and that I had slept in the chair. He had known about the chair. That nearly undid me, and I let it show because the new policy was full price or nothing. When my turn came, I gave him the ledger plainly, without cruelty and without discount. The weekends on the corridor while Dad was dying, the aid I paid for and laundered through a fictional veteran's benefit, the commissioning hall in 1993, and the two faces that were not in the crowd. I told him what it does to a person to be introduced for a lifetime with a wave instead of a name. He did not defend himself once. Twice he started to, the reflex of a man trained in design review, and twice he stopped the sentence with his own hand and let the point land unanswered. Near the end, he said the truest thing he has ever said to me. I told myself, you didn't need anything from us. He said, you were the strong one, you were squared away, you made it so easy to believe. And believing it meant I never had to show up, and never showing up meant believing it harder. It was a machine. I built it. I'm an engineer, and I built a machine for not knowing my sister, and I ran it for 30 years. Then I gave him the terms, and I gave them the way I have given terms my whole professional life, numbered, unambiguous, achievable. 1. No instant reset. We were not going to hug in a diner and skip to the credits. Trust would be rebuilt at the speed of evidence. 2. No performances. He would not narrate our reconciliation at family events or convert it into anecdote. The repair was not content. 3. He would show up for our mother without scorekeeping and without press releases because she had spent 50 years subsidizing the family's silences, and her account was the most overdrawn at the table. 4. He would never again answer the question, what does your sister do? Not because I needed him to recite my rank, but because the answer was mine, and he had been spending it for decades. He accepted all 4 without negotiation, which is how I knew the letter had been real. Negotiators negotiate. The repentant just sign. And then with the terms done and the rice pudding arriving, came the small moment that I think about more than any other part of that morning. My brother looked at me across the booth and asked, so what is it you actually do? Not the cocktail version. I have wanted to ask for years, and I made it impossible. First time in decades, maybe ever, with the want showing. So I told him, the unclassified outline, the requirements work, the war games, the long decade of arguing the future into a budget line, the system under the black drape that his own division had bent metal for. And my brother, 58 years old, sideways promoted, lanyard surrendered, listened the way he listened on the slag heap in 1985, leaning in, interrupting only to ask better questions, the smartest boy in Scranton meeting the smartest person in the family, both of them finally off the clock. The bond did not come back that morning. Something better happened. The old bond, the one from the back steps, flickered up through 40 years of sediment, changed, scarred, adult, and alive. We sat with it for a while. Then he picked up the check, and I let him. And we stood on the sidewalk in the cold and did not hug. And both of us understood that not hugging, that morning, was its own kind of accuracy. The hug needed to be earned too. It would be. My mother was on her porch when I drove back through the neighborhood, because mothers are an intelligence network older than any I have worked with. She did not ask how it went. She poured a second cup of coffee, and we sat with the porch blanket across our knees like the women of this family have sat for 100 years. And she watched the street and finally said, 50 years, I watched him take the light. You never once asked me to move the lamp. I had no answer for that. I took her hand, and we sat there. And for once in my 54 years, I let my mother see the full cost of the quiet daughter, every decimal of it, with no rounding. She held my hand and absorbed it the way she has absorbed everything, without flinching, and then she said, well, and that was the porch's whole verdict. Well, in my mother's dialect, that is also a paragraph. Spring came, and with it, motion. Not resolution. I want to be careful with that word because this part of the story is the part where nothing concludes and everything shifts, the way the light changes before a season commits. In April, the program reached its fielding milestone, and I flew down to Quantico for the ceremony where the first operational units drew the new kit. There's a moment at every fielding that civilians never get to see. The speeches end, the bunting comes down, and then actual Marines, 22-year-olds, with the future of the institution in their hands and no idea of it, start touching the equipment, complaining about it immediately, which is how Marines express love. A corporal walked me through the system's interface that afternoon, patient and slightly condescending, explaining to the older blonde woman in the visitor badge how the network display worked, no idea who I was or what my signature had to do with the screen in his hands. I asked dumb questions on purpose. He answered every one. Somewhere in the middle of it, I felt the whole arc of my professional life settle into place with an almost audible click. Nobody salutes a requirements document. That is exactly why I love them. The work was never supposed to know my name. It was supposed to work. That same month, word came through Vega that Sergeant Lambert had pinned Staff Sergeant. His board had met in March, and the after-action protocol, his protocol, had been adopted at 3 more installations, with a service-level review underway. A letter arrived for me through channels, 4 sentences, drafted with terrifying care. He thanked me for, his words, the second chance I didn't deserve and won't waste. I disagree with half of that sentence, and I have decided to let him win the argument by outliving it. Watching that young man convert the worst morning of his career into doctrine, while a man 30 years his senior was still learning to say my sister out loud, had taught me more about character than any commission ever did. And Mitchell. Here's the report on Mitchell, and the reason I trust it. There was nothing to report. No announcements, no performances, no narrated growth. In March, my mother mentioned, in passing, mid-recipe, that Mitchell had driven her to her cardiology appointment in Wilkes-Barre. I asked when. She said, "Oh, weeks ago. He didn't want to fuss." He had told no one. He had kept term 3 in the one place terms count, the place where nobody's watching and nothing is scored. I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen and realized I was smiling at a cabinet. Denise noticed the change before I did, because of course she did. We were at her place on a Saturday in late April, planning nothing, which after 4 decades of planning everything is the most luxurious activity either of us knows. She looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "You've stopped flinching when the phone says Scranton." She was right. The bracing was gone. For 30 years, every call from home had arrived preloaded, a little tension in the jaw before the first hello. Sometime that spring, without ceremony, the tension had simply failed to show up for work. I told Denise I did not entirely trust its absence. She said, "That's because you've never had a demilitarized zone before. Give it a season." Then, in the first week of May, my mother called with the invitation that the whole spring had been quietly assembling toward. Her 80th birthday, Memorial Day weekend, the backyard on Capuz Avenue, the whole family, cousins, aunts, the folding tables, the potato salad politics, all of it. The first full gathering since the Expo. I said of course I would be there. And then my mother, 80 years old minus 3 weeks, said something that stopped me against the kitchen counter. "Come as yourself this time," she said. "All of you. You've been sending a representative for 40 years, honey. I'd like to meet my daughter before I'm too old to remember the meeting." I hung up and stood in front of my closet for a while, looking at the uniform on its hanger, 3 stars asleep on the shoulders, and I did not know what all of me wears to a backyard in Scranton. The uniform was true, but so was the gray suit, and so was the girl with the broom. The question followed me to bed and was still sitting on the nightstand in the morning. When the whole family was finally in one room again, with the ledger open on the table and my brother holding a pen, who would Mitchell Calloway say his sister was? I found out on the last Saturday of May in the backyard I grew up in, under a sky doing its absolute best work. I wore civilian clothes in the end. A plain jacket, good shoes, my hair down for once. The choice was deliberate, and it was the entire thesis of this story, so I will say it carefully. I did not need the uniform to be all of me. I needed the people in that yard to finally see all of me in a plain jacket, the way the chairman of the Joint Chiefs could see it in a convention center. The stars were never the point. The seeing was the point. So I walked into my childhood backyard, dressed almost exactly as I had been dressed at the Expo doors in October, and this time nobody sent me around back. The front door of the house I grew up in stood open, and my mother was holding court at 80 in a lawn chair like a throne, and the yard smelled like cut grass and charcoal and 50 years of the same potato salad. For an hour, it was simply a party, and I want to honor that hour. My aunts told me about their knees. The cousins relitigated a 1996 softball game. My mother opened cards with the focused greed of a woman who has earned every envelope. Mitchell was there with his family, easy in a way I had not seen him at a gathering in years, carrying chairs, refilling iced tea, taking no podiums. We worked the same yard at a comfortable distance, two ships aware of each other's draft. And then, mid-afternoon, the old question arrived on schedule, wearing a new husband. A cousin's recent groom, nice man, knew nobody, was making the rounds of introductions, and he reached me with a paper plate in his hand and asked the question this family has been mishandling since the Reagan administration. So what do you do? I felt the practiced, small answer rise in my throat. 50 years of reflex. Oh, I'm in the service. And before it cleared, my brother set down his drink. He did not raise his voice, but the yard has good acoustics, and Callaways have always known how to find them. My sister, he said, is Lieutenant General Audrey Callaway, United States Marine Corps. She is the deputy commandant who decides what Marines will carry into harm's way for the next 20 years. The system half the jobs in this valley depend on exists because of her. And I have been getting that introduction wrong for 30 years, so I wanted to get it right in front of everybody. The yard went quiet, the particular quiet of a family hearing a ledger read aloud at last. Then my mother laughed, a delighted, unburdened 80-year-old laugh. And the quiet broke into questions. Real ones. Finally, the cousins turning toward me with their paper plates like a small Congress convening. What was Iraq like? What does a deputy commandant do? Did you really meet the chairman? Why didn't you ever say? I answered all of it. So it took an hour. It took 40 years. Both clocks are right. Later, when the cake was down to archaeology, Mitchell gave our mother his gift. He had restored a photograph, cleaned and reframed it, and when she turned it around, I had to sit down on a folding chair. The slag heap, 1985. 2 kids squinting into the sun, a balsa and cardboard rocket between them. He had found the negative in our father's effects in a machinist's toolbox, which means Raymond Callaway had kept it for 34 years, which is a sentence about my father I am still learning to read. On the back of the frame, in Mitchell's engineering hand, was written, the smartest person in the family. Always was. My mother put it on the mantel that evening, in the spot where the portrait of the shop used to hang. And if you want to know what winning actually looks like in stories like mine, it is not a saluting admiral or a room on its feet. It is your mother adjusting a frame 1 degree, stepping back and nodding once, like a stamp. The rest of the afternoon was small joys, and I collected them deliberately, the way you collect shells. I taught a cousin's boy how to sight down a model rocket fin for the seam. Vega texted me that Lambert's protocol had been issued as service-wide interim guidance, and I read it, smiled, and put the phone away without answering, because nothing in that device could improve the yard, the light, or the sound of my mother laughing at her own joke before the punchline. Toward evening, I stood at the back fence with a cup of coffee, watching the lightning bugs start their shift, and I let myself finish the accounting at last. I never needed the room to stand up for me. The room standing was never the wound or the cure. I needed one person, at one door, on one ordinary Tuesday, to say 4 easy words. That's my sister, Sergeant. As it took him 30 years, 4 handwritten pages, and a diner on Moosic Street to find them, and he found them, and I want you to hear that part clearly, because the internet is full of stories where the family never finds the words, and the bridge burns gorgeously and everyone applauds the flames. This is not that story. The bridge held. It needed 40 years of repairs it should never have needed. But it held. So here is what I know, and what I will leave you with. One woman to whoever is sitting out there, with their own ledger open on their knees. If someone has been getting your introduction wrong your whole life, you do not have to shrink to fit their version. You also do not have to detonate the table to correct it. You can simply stop paying the subsidy. Stand at your full height, in a gray suit or 3 stars or an apron, whatever the day requires, and let the distance show, and let the people who love you walk it. The ones who are worth keeping will make the trip. My brother did, the long way, around the back of everything, through the loading dock of his own conscience. The truth does not need a VIP badge. It does not need the blue carpet or the front row. It just needs time and one door somebody finally holds open, front entrance, eyes up. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. It means more than you know. Now I want to hear from you. Has someone in your family spent years getting your introduction wrong, and what did it cost you to keep the peace? If a door like that loading dock ever closed in front of you, who was standing beside it, and did they speak up? And if you ever got the real apology, the one with the second part said out loud, did it feel like winning or like grief? Tell me in the comments. I read them, and so do thousands of people who have walked the same long way around the building. If this story hit home, hit that like button and subscribe, and share it with someone who has been taking the long way around for too long. Stand at your full height. The truth doesn't need a VIP badge.